Every story leaves something behind. A whisper, a shadow, a question that was never answered. Here, we dig through the forgotten files, the unsolved mysteries, the chilling true crimes, and the horrors people wish had stayed buried. From haunted legends to real-life nightmares, every tale is pulled straight from the horror archives. So turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and step carefully, because once a story enters the horror archives, it never truly leaves.
Ice fishing. There's something about it that most people don't think about. You're standing on a frozen surface above an entire world of black water. You can't see what's under you. You can't hear what's moving beneath your feet. But sometimes, something down there knows you're standing right above it. These are 5 true ice fishing horror stories. This first story was sent in by a listener who fishes a remote bay in Lake of the Woods, up near the Canadian border. He calls it the hole that was already there. It's the kind of story that starts slow, just a small detail that doesn't add up, but by the end, you realize the wrong detail was there long before he ever noticed it. When I got to my spot that morning, there was already a hole drilled in the ice, about 6 inches from where I always set up. I fished the same coordinates every winter on Lake of the Woods, up near the Ontario border. I've been coming to the same stretch of ice since I was 14, and I've never once seen another person fish that particular bay. It's too shallow for walleye, too deep for panfish. I catch perch there, decent ones, but nobody else bothers. The hole was fresh. The edges weren't refrozen, and there were no slush shavings around it, which was strange because when you auger a hole, there's always debris. It was like the ice had simply opened. I knelt down and looked into it. The water was black, which was normal for early morning before the sun gets high enough to light the column. But the hole was perfectly round, not auger round, geometrically perfect. I shrugged it off and drilled my own hole about 10 feet away, set up my portable shanty, dropped my jig and started fishing. About 40 minutes in, I noticed my line wasn't hanging straight. It was drifting toward that other hole. Not fast, just a slow, lazy pull to the left. I reeled up, checked my jig, dropped it again. Same thing, lateral drift toward the open hole. I walked over and looked down into it again. The water was still black, but now it looked thick, like the surface tension was wrong. I dropped a piece of wax worm into it just to watch it sink, and it didn't. It sat on the surface of the water for about 3 seconds, then slid under without a ripple. I went back to my hole and kept fishing. Caught 2 decent perch over the next hour. Normal morning, but around 10, I noticed the other hole had grown. Not by much, maybe an inch wider in diameter. I told myself it was just melt from the sun, but it was 11 below zero. Nothing was melting. By noon, it was noticeably larger. I put my boot next to it for reference and took a photo. The hole was maybe 14 inches across now. I packed up early that day. I came back the next morning and the hole was gone. Frozen over completely, like it had never been there. But when I drilled my hole and dropped my line, something pulled back. Not a fish. Fish pulled down or to the side. This pulled straight down hard, like my jig had been grabbed. The line went taut and then slack, and when I reeled it up, the jig was gone. Not broken off. The knot was still intact. The hook had been straightened completely flat, like someone had taken pliers to it. I fished for 2 more hours because I'm stubborn, but the whole time I could hear something under the ice. Not tapping, not cracking, breathing, a slow, rhythmic pulse that I could feel through the soles of my boots. I packed up and drove the snowmobile back to the cabin. I haven't been back to that bay since. Last spring, I was looking at satellite imagery of the lake on Google Earth, and I noticed something. In the shallow bay where I always fished, there was a dark circle visible beneath the surface. It was there in every image going back to 2016. I'd been fishing next to it for years, and something about that last detail really gets to me. The idea that whatever was under there, it had always been under there, and he'd been sitting right on top of it every winter for years. Let's move on. This next story comes from 2 friends fishing Mill Lacs in Minnesota. It's called the Shanty on the Pressure Ridge. If you've ever been on a frozen lake at night, you know how sounds carry. Now imagine hearing footsteps circling your shelter and finding bare footprints in the snow the next morning. There was a shanty sitting on the pressure ridge about 300 yards from our camp, and nobody could figure out how it got there. Pressure ridges are exactly what they sound like. Jagged seams of broken ice that buckle upward when 2 plates push together. You don't set up on them. You don't even walk on them if you can avoid it. But this shanty was perched right on top of one, tilted about 15 degrees to the left, like it had been placed there on purpose. This was on Mill Lacs, mid-January. My buddy Derek and I had a permanent fish house about a mile offshore. We'd been out there for 3 days. The shanty showed up on the morning of the 4th day. It was a wood frame flip-over, painted dark red, no logos, no reflective tape, no registration sticker. It looked old. The wood was gray under the paint. We watched it through binoculars for most of the morning. Nobody went in or out. There was no snowmobile or ATV near it. No tracks in the snow leading to or from it. It was just there. That afternoon, Derek wanted to walk over and check it out. I didn't, but I went anyway. The closer we got, the worse it smelled. Not rotting fish. Something chemical and sweet, like antifreeze mixed with something organic. The door was a plywood panel on hinges. It was closed but not latched. Derek knocked. The sound was wrong. It didn't echo like knocking on a hollow structure should. It sounded dense, like the inside was full of something. He knocked again, and we both heard a sound from inside. Not a voice. A wet shifting, like a heavy tarp being dragged across a floor. Derek opened the door maybe 3 inches. The smell hit us like a wall, and he gagged and slammed it shut. I caught a glimpse of the inside. There were no fishing holes cut in the floor. The floor was just ice, and it was dark underneath. But there were marks on the interior walls. Not words, tallies, hundreds of them scratched into the wood with something sharp, covering every surface I could see in that brief moment. We went back to our fish house and called the resort that managed the ice road. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Nobody came that day. That night around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. Not the usual ice cracking and booming. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps on the ice outside our house. I looked at Derek and he was awake too, sitting up in his sleeping bag, not moving. The footsteps circled our fish house 3 times. Then they stopped right outside the door. We sat there in the dark, listening. After about 5 minutes of silence, there was a single knock on our door. The same dense, muffled sound. Neither of us answered. Neither of us moved. The footsteps eventually walked away, back toward the pressure ridge. In the morning, we looked outside. There were footprints in the snow. They were bare feet. Human bare feet in 15 below zero. They came from the direction of the shanty, circled our house exactly as we'd heard, and led back toward the ridge. When we looked toward the shanty with binoculars, it was gone. The pressure ridge was still there, but the shanty had vanished. There was a dark rectangular stain on the ice where it had been, and nothing else. Derek and I packed up that morning. We never went back to that spot on Mill Lacs. I asked the resort about it a week later, and they said no one had reported a shanty on the pressure ridge. They said no one had called them about it at all. I know I called. I have the number in my phone history, but they had no record of it. And bare footprints in the snow, in January, on Mill Lacs. I think that detail is what makes this one stick with me. Not the shanty, not the tallies on the walls, the bare feet. This 3rd story is called The Man in the Next House Over. It was sent in by someone who fishes a small lake in northern Wisconsin that he refuses to name. It starts out completely normal, just another angler setting up nearby. But something about this other fisherman is deeply, fundamentally wrong. I could see his shadow through the canvas of his pop-up shelter, and he hadn't moved in 4 hours. I was ice fishing alone on a small lake in northern Wisconsin, about an hour south of Minocqua. It's a lake I won't name because I still fish it, and I don't want company. It's maybe 200 acres, spring-fed deep in the middle. Good for crappie. I'd been set up since dawn. Around 8, a truck pulled onto the lake from the public landing on the east shore. A man got out, unloaded a pop-up shelter, an auger and a bucket. He set up about 60 yards from me, close enough to see, too far to talk. Normal ice fishing etiquette. He went into his shelter, and I went back to watching my rods. The thing is, I never heard his auger. Those things are loud, whether they're gas or electric or hand-cranked. I should have heard something, but he just went into his shelter, and that was it. I figured maybe he'd pre-drilled his holes earlier in the week. Around noon, I looked over and noticed his shadow hadn't changed position. He was sitting on what looked like his bucket, hunched forward slightly, arms at his sides. Perfectly still. No jigging motion, no reaching for anything, no shifting his weight. I watched for a solid 10 minutes. Nothing. I told myself he was watching a tip-up, being patient, but something about the stillness bothered me. It wasn't the stillness of someone waiting. It was the stillness of an object. Around 2, I walked over. I called out when I was about 30 feet away. No answer. I called again at 10 feet. Nothing. I could see his shadow clearly through the orange fabric of the shelter. Same position, same posture. I said excuse me, said I was just checking if he was all right. The shadow didn't move. I unzipped the door. The shelter was empty. There was no bucket, no auger, no holes drilled in the ice, no fishing gear of any kind. Just an empty pop-up shelter on bare ice. But I could still see the shadow. From outside, looking at the fabric, there was clearly a human silhouette sitting inside. From inside, there was nothing. I stepped back out and looked at the shelter from the outside. The shadow was still there, staring, hunched, arms at its sides. I walked around the shelter in a full circle. The shadow was visible from every angle, which isn't how shadows work. A shadow cast by the sun would only appear on one side. I zipped the shelter closed and walked back to my setup. I reeled in my lines and started packing. While I was breaking down my shanty, I heard a zipper. I looked over and the door of his shelter was open. Not flapping in the wind, just open. The shadow was gone. I looked toward the truck on the landing. It was still there, engine off. But now there was someone sitting in the driver's seat. I could see a silhouette through the rear window. Same posture, hunched forward, arms at sides. I loaded my sled and drove my snowmobile off the opposite side of the lake. I took the long way around through the forest roads to avoid the east landing entirely. When I got home, I pulled up the lake on the DNR access page just to see if anything looked unusual on the satellite photo. The image was from summer. The lake was open water, empty, except for a dark smudge on the ice, which made no sense because there was no ice in the photo. It was July, but the smudge was there, roughly where his shelter had been. I zoomed in as far as the resolution allowed. The smudge had the vague proportions of a sitting human figure. I went back to that lake a month later. The pop-up shelter was gone. The truck was gone, but there was a single hole in the ice, right where his shelter had been. It wasn't drilled, it was melted. The edges were smooth and rounded, like the ice had been heated from below. The water in the hole was warm to the touch, and a shadow with no source, visible from every angle. That one is going to stay with me for a while, but the next story is where things get much worse. Story number 4 is called 32 Minutes Under. This one involves a man fishing a flooded reservoir in Minnesota, one of those man-made lakes that swallowed an entire town when the dam went up. There are old foundations down there, old roads, an old church, and apparently something else. My GPS fish finder showed something hovering at 18 feet that wasn't a fish. It was too large, too stationary, and it was rising. I was alone on a small reservoir in northern Minnesota, one of those man-made lakes that flooded a valley back in the 40s. There are old foundations down there, fence lines, the skeleton of a church. I'd seen them on sonar before, but this was different. The object was roughly 6 feet long, vertical in the water column, and it was ascending at a rate of about 1 foot per minute. My sonar paints moving objects in a color gradient. Green for slow, red for fast. This thing was solid green, drifting upward with no visible propulsion. No fin movement, no current signature, just rising. I watched it for 10 minutes. When it reached about 12 feet, my jig rod went dead. Not a break. The line just went slack, and when I reeled up, there was nothing on the end. The hook, the split shot, the jig head, all gone. Clean separation right at the swivel. The object on sonar paused at 12 feet and stayed there. I switched to my second rod and dropped a new jig. The moment it hit 12 feet, the line went taut and then slack. Same thing, everything below the swivel gone. I turned off the fish finder and sat there for a minute. The ice was making noises, which is normal. Thermal expansion creates booms and cracks that sound like distant artillery. But between the booms, I heard something else. A tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from directly below my hole. 3 taps a pause, 3 taps a pause. I looked down into the hole. The water was clear enough to see maybe 4 feet down. At the edge of visibility, I could see something pale. It was moving, slowly rotating, like it was caught in a gentle current. Except there is no current in that reservoir. It's still water. The pale shape drifted closer to the surface. I could see detail now. It was a hand. An open hand, palm up, fingers slightly curled. It was the color of old wax. It rotated slowly and then descended back into the dark. I should have left. I know that. But I was frozen in place, and I don't mean from the cold. I mean I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond. My arms were locked at my sides. I sat on my bucket and stared into that hole for what felt like hours, but was actually 32 minutes. I know because I checked my phone after. During those 32 minutes, the hand came back 3 more times. Each time it was closer to the surface. Each time it stayed longer. The third time, the fingers moved. They closed slowly into a fist and then opened again, 1 finger at a time, like a greeting or a beckoning. The fourth time, the hand came up far enough that I could see a wrist, then a forearm. The skin was wrong. It wasn't waterlogged or bloated. It was smooth and dry-looking, even submerged. The arm extended upward until the fingertips were maybe 8 inches below the surface of the water in my fishing hole. Then it stopped. That's when I could move again. Whatever had locked me in place released, and I threw myself backward off the bucket so hard I cracked the back of my head on the ice. I scrambled to my feet and looked back at the hole. 5 fingertips were resting on the surface of the water, not breaking through, just resting on the surface tension like it was a pane of glass. They stayed there for about 10 seconds. Then they pressed down and slid beneath the surface. The tapping started again, faster this time. I left everything. The shanty, the rods, the auger, the fish finder. I ran to my truck and drove home. I went back 2 days later with my brother to retrieve my gear. Everything was where I'd left it, but the hole had frozen over. We chipped it open to pull out the transducer from my fish finder. When we got it out, there were scratches on the plastic housing. Long, parallel scratches in groups of 5. I returned the fish finder to the manufacturer because it stopped working after that. They called me a week later and asked what I'd been using it in. I said ice fishing, a reservoir in Minnesota. They said the transducer had been crushed from the outside, like something had squeezed it. They said the pressure required to do that kind of damage was equivalent to a depth of roughly 800 feet. That reservoir is 40 feet deep at its center. And 800 feet of pressure in a 40-foot lake. I don't know what to do with that information. And honestly, neither did he. This last story is the one that disturbed me the most when I read it. It's the longest and it's the most detailed, and I believe every word of it. It's called The Sound the Lake Made at Night. It was submitted by a member of a volunteer search and rescue team in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. A man went missing on a frozen lake. They found his camp. They found his gear. They found a trail of holes in the ice leading into the deepest part of the lake. And then, one of the rescuers went back alone. We found the camp on the ice before we found the person, and I want to be clear about the order of what we saw. I was part of a volunteer search and rescue team in northern Michigan. In February of last year, a man named Gerald Prout was reported missing after failing to return from a solo ice fishing trip on a remote lake in the Upper Peninsula. He was 67, experienced, had fished that lake for over 30 years. His truck was found at the access point. His snowmobile was found about a half-mile out on the ice, engine off, key in the ignition. I was on the team that went out the next morning. There were 8 of us, plus 2 DNR officers. The lake was about 400 acres, surrounded by state forest. No cabins, no cell service, no other vehicles at the landing. Gerald's snowmobile was parked next to a permanent ice shanty, a wooden structure about 6 by 8 feet, painted green, bolted to a plywood platform that sat on the ice. It was his shanty. He'd been using it for decades. The door was open, not broken, just open. Inside, everything was arranged normally. 2 fishing rods set up over 2 holes in the ice. A propane heater still connected but off. A folding chair. A thermos of coffee still half full. A sandwich in a plastic bag, 1 bite taken. His phone was on the floor, powered off. His jacket was draped over the chair. It was 9 degrees outside. He had left his jacket. We searched the surrounding ice in an expanding grid. About 200 yards south of the shanty, we found a second set of holes. 2 holes drilled clean, about 3 feet apart. No shanty, no shelter, no equipment around them. Just 2 holes in the ice in the middle of nowhere. The ice around them was discolored, not melted or thinned, stained, a deep brownish red that had seeped into the ice itself, like a dye. One of the DNR officers knelt down and said it wasn't blood. He said it smelled like lake water, but the color was wrong. We kept searching. A quarter mile past the stained holes, we found another pair. Same spacing, same diameter, same discoloration. Then another pair a quarter mile further. Then another. They formed a straight line heading south across the lake, toward the deepest part. We followed the line of holes for over a mile. Each pair was identical. Each had the same staining. The ice got thinner as we moved toward the center of the lake, and the team leader called us back before we reached the end of the line. We never found the last pair. We didn't find Gerald that day, or the next day, or the day after that. The official search was suspended after a week. But I went back. I went back alone on a Saturday night, which I know was stupid. I parked at the landing and walked out to Gerald's shanty with a flashlight and a handheld radio. The shanty was still there. The door was closed now, though no one on our team had closed it. I opened it and everything inside was exactly as we'd found it, except the thermos was empty. The coffee was gone. The sandwich was gone. The plastic bag was still there, but empty. I walked south following the line of holes. Most had frozen over by then, but I could see the stained patches in the ice. I followed them for about a half-mile before I heard it. The lake was making a sound, not the usual cracking and settling. A low, sustained tone, like a pipe organ played at the lowest possible register. I could feel it in my chest. It was coming from beneath me, from the water under the ice, and it was moving. The source of the sound was traveling south along the same line as the holes, like something was swimming beneath me, following the path. I stood still and listened. The tone shifted. It split into 2 tones, then 3, layering on top of each other in a way that sounded almost like a voice. Not words, just the shape of a voice, the cadence of speech without language. My flashlight flickered and I looked down. The ice beneath my feet was clear, and for a moment I could see into the lake. The water was lit from below by a faint luminescence, and in that light I could see the bottom. There were holes in the lake bed, dozens of them, not drilled from above, bored from below, punching up through the sediment. They were arranged in pairs, stretching in a line across the bottom of the lake, mirroring the holes in the ice above. In the space between 2 of those holes, I saw Gerald Prout. He was standing on the bottom of the lake, not floating, standing. His feet were on the sediment, his arms at his sides, his head tilted slightly upward, like he was looking at me through 40 feet of water and 12 inches of ice. His eyes were open, his mouth was open, and he was the one making the sound. The tones were coming from him, from his open mouth, amplified by the water, resonating through the ice. He stood there and he sang, if you can call it that, this shapeless, droning, layered sound that I can still hear when the house gets quiet at night. I ran all the way back to my truck, and I drove home, and I told no one what I saw. Gerald Prout was officially declared dead 3 months later. His body was never recovered. The lake was dragged in the spring. They found nothing, but I pulled up the county's bathymetric survey of that lake last month. The depth chart shows a maximum depth of 44 feet. Except along one line, running north to south through the center of the lake, the sonar recorded no bottom at all. The signal just kept going. The surveyors noted it as an equipment malfunction. I don't think it was a malfunction. I think the lake has no bottom along that line. I think it just keeps going. And I think Gerald Prout is still down there, standing in the dark, singing to whatever is listening. And that's where the story ends. No resolution, no explanation, just a man standing on the bottom of a lake that has no bottom, singing. If you're an ice fisherman, you know the sounds a lake makes at night. The booming, the cracking, the groaning. Next time you hear something under the ice that doesn't sound like any of those things, don't listen too closely. You might start to hear words.
And that's where tonight's file closes, but the archives are far from empty. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover more horrors, mysteries, and true crimes hidden in the horror archives. Until next time, keep the lights low, keep listening, because you never know what story we'll uncover next.